Well, hello. My name is Sean Smith, and I apologize for missing out on the National Catholic Board on Full Inclusion's event there in Northern Virginia on Monday, March 20th. We were originally scheduled to present on the 21st, and then because Beth needed to switch things around, totally understandable. Sadly, I was with another archdiocese working with them on this idea of full inclusion, of course, on Monday the 20th, and so missed out on the face-to-face presentations. And then travel considerations got in the way of the 21st, so totally missed out. But I hope by sharing it in this venue, this might be helpful to many of us that are trying to facilitate full inclusion or inclusionary efforts across our Catholic schools. And so let me get started. My hope and effort today is to give you some resources and some ideas to further integrate the framework of the Universal Design for Learning, something that I've been working with for the last 20 years with CAST and other collaborators. But I'm going to give you some resources, give you some ideas, and personalize it through my own son in our efforts to further include all our students across our K-8 and 9-12 Catholic schools. So with that said, my focus today, as I mentioned just a moment ago, agenda-wise, is to think about the framework, but also really think about this meaningful inclusion and how do we facilitate meaningful inclusion for all our individuals. And so that's what I'm going to try to center on today. And as I get started here, let me make sure introduce myself a little bit more thoroughly. I am a faculty member here at the University of Kansas. I've been out here for years, but I'm also working with and have worked with the Kansas City, Kansas Archdiocese for nearly 20 years. FIRE program here in the Kansas City, Kansas area, and Kansas City, Missouri area, and actually FIRE has gone national. So I've worked with them for, 2 decades. I've also helped develop and teach in the University of Notre Dame's PI program with Christy Bonafiglio and my colleague Michael Fagella-Luby. I actually am teaching the online class this semester. I'll be grading after I share this presentation. I've actually worked in the Arlington Archdiocese. One of our social skills virtual reality programs is being used at St. Timothy's as we speak. And I've worked with Paul VI, and I've also worked with St. Mark's and a few other schools there in the Arlington Archdiocese. One of my sisters actually teaches, Mary Bridget Cahill, at St. Louis. I have another sister, Maureen Long, that teaches in the Archdiocese, and my sister, Margie Lozelle, is a religious education coordinator there for Holy Trinity out there in Gainesville, Bristow. And if you've done the Bethlehem Walk, Margie is the one that organizes that, and her family of 7 lives that for the month of December. All right, enough on the Catholic education, which is of course critical, but enough on my credentials there. Let's get started. Oh, and by the way, I'm also I taught in Fairfax County. I taught at Chantilly High School and also Akatinka Academy. Did my master's at George Mason and did my doctorate at the University of Virginia. So I have several Virginia connections. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be there face to face. But let's talk about this meaningful inclusion idea. And many of us, of course, our efforts, many of you are exemplars of your efforts to include individuals with disabilities across the exceptionality categories, as well as struggling learners, and those, of course, that we would say are typical, but of course, learn a bit differently. So when I think of meaningful inclusion, several things come to mind, and one of the things that comes to mind is the fact that there's very much specific and unique instructional supports to the needs of the individual. And these are all individuals, particularly those with identified disabilities. Next is we align it with the overall expectations, and those are school, community, our parish, our faith, expectations in terms of work and employment. All those things tie into what we need to do to really meaningfully include our individuals, not only in our current settings, but also within society and with our parish and with our faith community. Next are these expectations. We have expectations that are measurable. So expectations that we can state, but also that we can measure progress so we can make certain that we have actually made efforts towards that. There's overall growth and development, and we're meeting those expectations. And then finally, we're not doing this in a vacuum. We're aligning this to the standards of learning. We're aligning this to the national standards. We're aligning this to things that are very much relevant to what we expect of all learners. And that's critical. That's critical. Meaningful inclusion doesn't mean that these students are doing something totally separate. They're very much aligned with their typically developing peers. So with that thought, I wanted to make sure I contextualize things. So I'm also a parent of a child with Down syndrome. I have 4 children, and Nolan's our second child, and he's currently finishing up the University of Kansas's 2-year program in post-secondary education. He lives in the dorms with everyone else. He takes classes with everyone else. These are all typically developing classes. They're classes that are expected with all the college students here. His efforts in early childhood education, but it's a certificate program. It's only 2 years, not a 4-year program. But I share this because is there are expectations that led to backward design and planning for Nolan right from the get-go. When he was 3, we were talking about these issues of what is he going to do when he is employed, what type of employment, what type of living situation he's going to be in, the level of independence, the place in this community, his involvement. And this all led to then efforts to, okay, where are we going to focus on for Nolan to be successful there? For example, speech was one of our primary focuses. Why speech? Well, if Nolan couldn't speak and interact and be understood, how can he be further included with his peers? How can he serve as an altar server? How can he serve currently as a lector in his parish? These things were meaningful for him, and of course, this is how we began to plan and design for that meaningful inclusion, and we used the framework to be able to facilitate that. So let's get started. So number 1 for me in this idea of planning for meaningful inclusion and utilizing the framework for doing that, to begin with, is this meaningful planning. So how do we go about planning and designing and really thinking about these critical elements? And I'd urge us to consider the MAP process. Now the MAP process is something we can use at any time during the year. It might be that annual review of the child, what we're trying to plan for. It might be something that we do in a small group at a certain time at the beginning of the academic year. It might be something we do at the end of the academic year. But the purpose of it here is we start thinking about the overall dreams, the dreams of the child, the dreams of the family members, the dreams of the overall educational community. What are we expecting? And these dreams can go beyond the academic year. The dreams can go beyond not only the year, the next year, it can go beyond the school setting. We might be 3rd graders, but we might be thinking about what we dream of that child when they enter the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade experience. Maybe that trip that we take annually, we dream, of course, that child's going to be participating in that. Maybe it's when they get to the high school setting and what we expect of them at the high school setting. And so we start talking about the strengths and needs of the individual. And as we fill this out, and this is a picture of Nolan's 3rd grade MAP process. I framed it because to me it's such a representative element of this. But we start thinking about elements of, for example, his dreams. Nolan dreamt that he was going to be married. He still wants to be married. He's going to live independently. He's going to be working a number of different things. Music's going to be part of his life. But there was also needs and strengths that we needed to consider as well to begin to identify his overall goals for that year, but also goals as we built upon it. And let me give you an example back to that speech. Speech was an underlying goal. So of course, it wasn't just speech inside a quiet setting, but it was speech in the context of a classroom. It was speech in the context of the community. It was ability to articulate enough so he could become a lector and be a meaningful part of his parish community. So those all became a part of that MAP program, that MAP planning for that meaningful inclusion. Now here are some hyperlinks to a variety of resources, including a video that also offers an illustration of the MAP process, where the teachers are there, mom and dad are there, maybe some outside folks in terms of the community, maybe a peer. It may be someone that's facilitating something in the parish, like altar server training or the lector training or other elements like that. As the child gets older, it may be some of the extracurricular activities that are involved. And it's a celebration of the child, but it's also a planning of the child. I can't urge you enough to consider this. It's something that has been critical in Nolan and his success throughout the years, including here at the University of Kansas. It offers elements of what you might be very familiar with, and that is that person-centered planning element, or that element of facilitating self-determination, or that transition planning that we do oftentimes, not just simply for the post-secondary, but the transition planning from when we switch from a K-5 to a 6, 7, and 8. And many of us have a K-8 environment, and yet, like our own school here, St. John's, 6th, 7th, and 8th tends to be a little bit different than K through 5, or K through 6 is a little different than 7 and 8. Those middle school students have a few more opportunities, some more different expectations. So that transition into those expectations, or the transition from middle school to high school, or transition from our early childhood program on our campus to our kindergarten classroom. Those are transitions, and those are things that need to be planned for meaningfully, where the MAP process can go a long way. Now you're like, okay, Sean, I didn't expect to hear about this MAP process. I expected to hear about the framework, and I expected to hear about ways to operationalize that. So let's talk about that. So when we're planning and designing, one of the things we're planning and designing when the MAP process can be quite helpful for is this idea of the barriers that we're facing. And oh my goodness, are there barriers out there for our learners? And they're not just students with disabilities, they're all our learners. Here's a visual I've shared just on 3 different areas. Think of the academic challenges that many of our students face. identified or non-identified. Think of the executive functions. Oh my goodness, are executive functions not the priority of the pandemic? Did we not learn a lot about what the executive function skills our students had and did not have when we went remote, when we went at a distance, when we went at a face-to-face, but we had to be very mindful of our distance because of the pandemic and due to COVID-19? Oh my goodness, those executive function skills that we took for granted, we realized, goodness, there's a lot of challenges for all our students there. And then, of course, our behaviors and levels of engagement, motivation. Have we not been challenged with that for all our learners, let alone students with disabilities? So these are elements that oftentimes cause barriers that we need to plan around, barriers that we need to design around and be able to further facilitate for all our learners, but particularly students with disabilities. Now, if you're like, okay, Sean, I'm thinking of a few barriers. If you want more, open up this Google presentation and you'll find that this is hyperlinked. And this is hyperlinked to a PDF that's about 10 pages long that offers all sorts of barriers, but also not only barriers, but also solutions to those barriers, particularly in the framework of universal design for learning. But remember, we're planning and designing around barriers that exist in our students' environment. And I'd ask you to take a pause and think about what are barriers in your classroom. They could be environmental. They could be the fact that the product we're using, and I'd offer an example of a lot of times the reading resources we use are produced at the grade level of the instruction. For fourth grade science, we have a fourth grade science resource that's generally produced at a fourth grade reading level. And yet we know a lot of learners, identified and non-identified, that don't read at the fourth grade reading level. Maybe that they're limited with some of their vocabulary. Maybe their fluency is not where it needs to be. Maybe it's that comprehension isn't at what we want it to be. And that could be fifth, sixth, seventh. I mean, third grade and on, we switch from reading to learn to learning to read. Learning to read to reading to learn. And so those elements there can cause barriers for a lot of our learners, let alone students with disabilities. So the barriers to consider in our classroom are the first thing that we need to appreciate, understand, identify, and then begin to design around. So this number two is this idea of the teaching. Of course, that's what we're all about, right? Our instruction. But when we think about instruction, what's the frameworks we use to be able to overall structure our instruction? So I think of a framework of a house. How's that solid? The cement poured, the 2x4s and the 4x4s used to organize and structure the different parts of the house, the rooms, the stairways, the hallways, etc. What are we using to guide our overall planning and designing for our instruction? And many of us are using lots of different things, but I'd urge us to consider and think about that design of our instruction. What are we using to focus and structure that, especially for the Nolans of the world? Now, there's many designs out there. Some of us are using frameworks for positive behavioral intervention supports. Others are using tiers and maybe multi-tiered systems of support, maybe other types of tiers. I'd argue, or maybe some of us are using differentiated instruction. But this idea of plan and designing for all individuals, which is critical. If we're going to be successful, we need to plan and design for all, for that meaningful inclusion. That includes the Nolans of the world. And I would argue the Universal Design for Learning framework is one way that's very meaningful. I'd argue that from a scholar, done a fair amount of research and published in this area that shows evidence in this area, but also as a parent who's lived it for 22 years, where the success of Nolan, who's employed right now as an early childhood educator here on campus at the University of Kansas, who is very much engaged and very much meaningfully included, who is meaningfully included throughout his academic career, and of course is very much engaged in his parish as an outcome. I'd argue that's evidence for me as well. Now, when I think of Universal Design for Learning, and many of us have seen this visual, maybe not the third part of this visual, but when I think of Universal Design for Learning, I think of the barriers. Now, let's talk about the barriers here in that first picture. The barriers there is a fence. But not only is the fence the barrier, but also the way we're trying to address the barrier. And that is, we've given everyone the same amount of supports, boxes. And of course, that's not relevant for the tall individual as well as for the middle individual. Well, that box is appropriate for them, but definitely not from the third individual in terms of much shorter. Now, think of the barrier, though. Think of the fence. Now, Sean, okay, this has nothing to do with education, and yet, to me, it does. And that is, there are certain things that need to be in place in what we do instructionally. So when I think of the barrier of the fence, that fence is there for a purpose of safety between the player and the audience, economics in terms of you need to get a ticket in order if you want to have access to that game. And so there's reasons for that fence for lots of different reasons. Now, the fence, though, could be transparent. And by being transparent in that third example, I don't need the boxes. I don't need to plan to design, or I plan to design with the transparency of the fence, so I don't need the boxes. And boxes, to me, in this instance, serve as accommodations. And what do I mean, Sean? Well, those boxes had to be created by somebody, right? Well, who created them? To me, those are accommodations and modifications that we as educators or the educators that support us are creating. So that's extra time, that's extra effort. And by the way, those boxes are unique not to all the students. They're unique to specific students. And so that's an extra effort we're having to do to be able to facilitate and support not that one student, but the two additional students. But if we take away the barrier, and that is the fence, and make it more transparent, the boxes disappear as well. So that plan designing can limit the needs for accommodations, can limit the needs for modifications, and therefore allow us to teach all individuals from the get-go in respect to how we've organized, structured our resources. To me, it's also a pathway in terms of being able to facilitate this. And so let's get into the framework. Many of us are familiar with this, but to me, I want to emphasize the fact that it's the what, how, and why of learning. And that is that multiple means of representation. We're going to facilitate, we're representing what we want the individual to understand and learn. How? We want them to demonstrate in multiple means, multiple options, what they've learned. And finally, we want them to engage it. The students need to understand the why. So we need to provide multiple means of engagement as well. And in doing so, there's several different ways to unpack this, but I'm going to unpack this with bicycles. And that is, if we take a look at the framework, we have the three principles across the top here: engagement, representation, action, expression. But also we have the guidelines that follow. So let's use engagement, for example. The first guideline is this idea of recruiting interest. Now, the third guideline in terms of multiple means of engagement is we want options for self-regulation. And in between, we want to develop persistence and effort. Or sustaining effort and persistence. So think of the bicycle analogy here. In the first bicycle, I'm the teacher bicycling along, and the students are sitting by and just taking it in. I'm recruiting their interest, and they're just taking it in. And there's some data out there that suggests 60 to 70% of the academic day we'll spend recruiting interest of the students. Now, that's great, but gosh, that's a lot of energy to recruit. While what about the actual instruction? So we need to go from recruiting interest to giving options where, okay, they're biking on their own with our supports, those training wheels, where we're sustaining their effort and facilitating levels of persistence. So yes, we can recruit interest, but we also want to facilitate that level of persistence. And finally, we want to get them to a 10 speed, where they're basically self-regulating. Now, can we do that in an academic year? Most likely not. This might be something that, as we're planning meaningfully across our K-8 environment, we're realizing that, okay, there'll be times where we're recruiting interest, and other times we can say during the academic development that we're giving some assistance with some training wheels. And then maybe by this level of their experience within St. John's or St. Charles or Corpus Christi, they've actually developed a level of self-regulation. Or maybe it's from a 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, what we expect at the 9th grade level and what we're building towards in our efforts at the 9th grade level for 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. So we think about this across time, but we also think about this across the UDL framework in the guidelines and the principles. So when I think of the various principles, there's things that come into play as well, and that is the barriers, back to what I mentioned a moment ago, is there's multiple ways to respond when I think about the framework. So the barrier of offering just one response, I'm going to give you multiple ways. So instead of just writing, I'm going to give you alternate ways to be able to respond, and they're going to be meaningful, they're going to align with my rubric, same expectations, but of course, there's different alternatives. And I'll give an example of that in just a moment. There's self-regulation supports built in. There's task options built in. There's supports in synthesizing information built in. There's activating background knowledge. There's various ways to share formats of text, etc. So this is an overall design thinking process. And by designing for all individuals, we're actually including all individuals in the process. I'm covering a lot of geography in a very limited period of time, but I want to give a couple examples here in just a moment, but I also want to give some resources. So far, what I've given so far are all hyperlinked, and let me emphasize this. These are hyperlinked examples here off the guidelines. This is an image hyperlinked in terms of overall design thinking ideas. This is a video where an individual 5th grade teacher who actually has attention issues himself talks about how he incorporates those three principles and the various guidelines for his 5th grade students. And he does it through a lot of problem-based, but also very high expectations for all individuals. All right, so what we're talking about in a way is what's our big idea? What are our critical elements we want to do instructionally? And then what are our outcomes for our learners? And from that, how are we going to assess those? How are we going to measure those? How are we going to make sure that they actually have met those outcomes? And then, of course, what activities and lessons will facilitate from it? So this idea of what are our big ideas, what's critical, and then planning from there. Let me contextualize it here for just a second. I'm going to use my own son, Nolan. So Nolan, in third or fourth grade, had an assignment that aligned with several different outcomes. One of it had to align with the fact that the students were about to get an understanding of their library skills. They needed to get into the library to get to primary sources, to understand how the library worked, to be able to get access to information, organize information, and then share that information. And they did it around the president. So it was a social studies and library science, but also there was a writing element to it, and so it was an English language arts component as well. So as I looked at this initially, I said, okay, there's some barriers here. Some barriers here, particularly, is the writing element. No one was organizing ideas. No one was learning. No one was able to access information and read. But writing was a significant challenge. And so I spoke to the teacher initially and said, listen, no one's going to have a challenge here. No one's going to have a challenge with the writing aspect, and that's going to be a critical element. And she's like, well, that's an expectation. Well, I'm like, well, is it really? And then we talked about that big idea, and writing wasn't a primary element. It was rather this is how she wanted it to be demonstrated, and she didn't have opportunities and time for students to do presentations, because that was one of the first things I recommended. But I did it in earshot of some other parents, and those other parents were like, wait, my child would love to be able to present as well. And I understand that you have to put a poster together and an essay, and you have to put that in the library, and there's an open house. Why don't we do the presentations during that open house? And next thing you know, it was Nolan and 5 other peers that were going to present. And it was going to be in the library, and instead of having a paper and a poster, he was going to do a presentation. And so that started things. Now, let me explain, though. In the process, he still needed to go to the library. He still needed to get original sources. He was identified with George Washington. So instead of the original sources being all reading materials, what Nolan also looked at was Nolan looked at resources affiliated with primary books, picture books, some videos, some audios, some elements there. And he learned about George Washington. There's no question he learned about George Washington in the process. And so in his learning about George Washington, and I'm running out of battery here, so let me connect into my battery. I'm sorry, guys, about that. So I'm just going to connect here. And notice I'm running out of battery. Apologize there. You might hear my battery going back and forth now. But back to the story with Nolan. Nolan knew George Washington. Let me give you an example. So when it came to the day where he actually had to provide his presidential report, oh my goodness, we had him all dressed up, as you can see in that picture. That was his Halloween costume for the year, by the way. He was all ready to go, and we had organized his information. We had outlined his information. And by the way, in outlining it, we didn't use a Word document. We used a graphic organizer, interactive graphic organizer. Inspiration was the application. So he organized all his thoughts visually, first of all, and then we turned those into words. The information he got, as I mentioned a moment ago, was through videos and pictures and things of that nature. And then he listened to some books as well. His auditory is much better than his reading ability. So anyways, he had all his information. We had a script, and we had organized it. We had practiced it. And the big ideas of the script is what he had. He wasn't word for word, but as you can see there in the picture, he had a script in front of him. But as we're leaving for the day, we had him all ready in terms of his George Washington costume. Now, he wasn't wearing all of it. He was going to get dressed in it later on. We're trying to get all 4 kids out the door. And at that time, I think they're all elementary age. Yeah, they're all elementary age. The youngest was in kindergarten at the time. And so here's Nolan. And all of a sudden he says, Nolan, I need a picture of Martha Washington. And I'm exasperated. We're trying to get everyone out the door, and Martha Washington's not part of the presentation. And as you can see, there's a picture of Martha Washington. So he's like, Dad, I need a picture. Fine. So I run upstairs and print out a copy. I print out a black and white copy. No, Dad, I need it color. Okay, I run back upstairs where our printer is. I print out a color picture. Get out the door, Nolan. He's like, Dad, I need it framed. So I quickly run and get a frame in the living room, throw the family picture out, put Martha Washington in, and we run out the door. And I'm like, what is with this kid? Anyways, drop the kid Nolan off, and later on that afternoon is when the presentation is. So I show up, and there's the other parents of the 6 total children. The 5 other parents sets are there. My wife is there, and we're thinking, aren't we lucky? Our kids are about to present. Everyone else, they have posters and papers, and the parents are there, but they're only looking at the still stuff, and we get a chance to have them present. We have Abe Lincoln, we have George Washington, we had Thomas Jefferson. I can't recall. I think we had John F. Kennedy. Anyways, so when Nolan goes up, Nolan starts his presentation, and I'm nervous. I'm sitting back there with the script on. Look at the script. Is he following the script? He's following the script. And all of a sudden, he goes off script. He starts talking about Martha Washington. I'm like, there's no Martha Washington. Where is he going with this? Well, where he's going with this is the fact that Martha Washington, well, that was his wife. So Nolan starts to talk about Martha Washington. He starts talking about how he loves Martha Washington as George Washington. He picks up that picture right next to him. He brings it over and he gives the picture a kiss. And he puts it back down and continues talking about Martha and then goes back on script. Did Nolan know about George Washington? Yeah, betcha. Not only did he know about George Washington, he ad-libbed with Martha Washington that he had learned about as well. So he learned it. He understood it. The success of what the teacher wanted, all A's. I mean, he hit it. He hit it on mark. But he needed to do it through a presentation in order to be able to really share what he knew. So that would be a planning design element with the framework in mind, with also multiple means of representation. Remember, the resources he accessed were a little different than his peers, but they're all in the library. He just went more to the kindergarten, first grade section versus his peers to the third, fourth grade section. So all that was aligned. And by the way, JJ, we have a son that's younger, when he got up to that class and he got participating in that class, almost everyone was doing presentations instead of the posters and the essays. So the teacher had seen the success through Nolan and his peers and pivoted from essays and posters to presentations. So again, it's not only just multiple means for Nolan, but in the end, that design for all individuals. So that's an example of kind of bringing universal design for learning into the classroom. Now let me give you another example. I didn't touch upon this, but one of the things is also, what are our goals? I said our big ideas, but what are our goals? And let me take an example here, and this is an old example, but it's an example I grabbed from Jeff Dietrich of the state of Michigan, a colleague of mine. So I'm grabbing his, and you're looking at this going, what is this? Well, it's the old Garmin visual. So think of our phones when we had them attached there to the Garmin site. They weren't our phones, but they were giving us our maps. But let's think of our traditional route. So think of it as our phone, but anyways, our traditional route. And our traditional route was one thing, but then we want to think of it from a design perspective. So let's think of this. Students will write a descriptive essay about Greek mythology. And so I'd urge us to think about, well, what does that mean? So many of us would say, well, what we want them to do is we want them to share what they know about Greek mythology. Yes, we do, but what we actually want them to do is we want them to write about Greek mythology. So in the end, we are going to measure them on their ability to write about what they know about Greek mythology. So in a way, what we're doing from a UDL perspective is we're offering them one traditional route. Well, Sean, where are the barriers there? Well, the barriers are, back to Nolan, the writing. So he may be able to share with you about Greek mythology, if that's our effort, which I think it is, but the writing process is going to be a problem. Now, we could separate the writing process with Greek mythology, because writing is important to develop, but if we're actually measuring Greek mythology through writing, then how do we separate out the writing element and that barrier? Well, one way to do it is to rethink that goal. Well, the goal is it really that we'll write a descriptive essay, or potentially is it the fact that students will demonstrate knowledge of Greek mythology? Well, here, it's the same type of outcome in respect to the Greek mythology, but a different route. So instead of that one traditional route, we've got multiple routes. So there's our one traditional route, and instead we have multiple routes here to be able to facilitate that outcome of getting there. It might take a little bit longer to get there. Well, sure, but still they can demonstrate. That's an overall key. And maybe we plan that in terms of the supports we offer, the different options we offer, the ways we group students, the way we organize material. And of course, not for today, but I'm going to use a rubric so I can measure students that want to do the writing, but also measure students that do also alternate opportunities to demonstrate what they know. That rubric will give me consistency across all our learners in terms of assessing those. All right, so I can go on and on and on, but I want to bring this to a close. So UDL in action, let's think of those 3 principles, and let's think of a few examples. So as we have over here, multiple means of representation. So we think of books at the reading level of the individual, and we think of videos on the topics that we can offer through visual and auditory processing aspects. We think of audio supports, including text-to-speech, where the individual has some independence that can see the text, hear the text, and also be facilitating their fluency and their decoding the phonological awareness, leading to comprehension. And finally, interactive graphic organizers that chunk information, that visualize information, that support information. Multiple means of action and expression, back to the interactive graphic organizers, I can use those to visually organize what I want to share with you, to make connections with what I want to share with you that goes beyond text. That's huge, huge, huge. Verbal presentations, and of course that adds to Nolan's speech and language goals, or overall anyone in terms of speech and language goals, but costumes, props, lots of different things, and of course that was illustrated with Nolan. And finally, multiple means of engagement, the ability to self-monitor, the ability to persist with a task, and things like with Nolan. Nolan was very engaged with George Washington to a point where he wanted to bring in Martha. He was very persistent on that. He enhanced the task. He added to the task due to his level of engagement, very different from a paper and or a poster presentation. All right, the elements of universal design for learning as we're thinking about this meaningful planning are we need to know, and the students need to know the goals, right? From the goals, we need to know how we're going to not only access, but how we're going to measure. We're going to make sure that our flexibility options are very much intentional. They're purposeful. We're just not giving a list of options. We're giving the options relevant to the needs of the learners that we have in our classroom. And finally, we're trying to build on this student's ability to internalize, to make it their own, to be engaged and monitor on their own. So those are all elements, not easy to do, but elements of that successful level of universal design for learning. So I want to leave you with some additional resources, everything from lesson plan templates to be able to facilitate this, to ideas of how to develop goals aligned with the universal design for learning framework, not only for ourselves, but to communicate to our students. If the students don't know where they're going, then how are they going to be engaged? We need to give them that roadmap. We need to give them the goals, and we need to give them relevant assessments. There's some wonderful resources out here. All these are hyperlinked. Everything from podcasts to videocasts to download templates to modules that walk you through the elements of universal design for learning. So those are all available to you. And then finally, I've given you some resources here. Everything from ideas in terms of templates to use, ideas in terms of steps to take, supports and overall resources. And then finally, there's some wonderful technology tips to utilize with universal design for learning so that we take those presentations and instead turn those into video presentations, audio presentations, podcasts, videocasts, where our learners, digital books, where our learners are utilizing those resources for multiple means of representation and demonstration. And then finally, I think you've got this, you're understanding this. I've asked you to think about how you and your peers are currently differentiating the instruction. How might you rethink the process based on what we're sharing here? And finally, how does it fit within the framework of universal design for learning? Now, as we go on here, one thing I want to leave us with is my own other son, JJ. And that is, I talked about those boxes early on with the fence. And I talked about those from accommodation perspective. And if you look at these accommodations 1 through 10, these are all things that could be relevant to Nolan or the Nolans of the world. But if we think of them from accommodation perspective, and the reason I'm bringing up JJ is he has an identified attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. He's a junior at Creighton, but attention has been his major concern. So he had a 504. He had accommodations in high school. He's still eligible for those accommodations at Creighton. But those accommodations are very specific and unique to him, and in implementing them, well, if we don't design and plan differently and simply say, well, we have this accommodation list we need to give to JJ, well, now we have these accommodations we need to give to Nolan, and then we have these accommodations for Bridget, and then for Mara, those are the other kids in my family, all of a sudden what we're finding is that, my goodness, we are spending a lot of time planning for just this one child or this 3 children or this extra 4 children. What about the other 20 children I have? Well, that's where, again, we think beyond the accommodations modifications and plan for all. And into the process, we embed elements of this, embed majority of this, and then maybe, yes, we have some students that need extended time. Fine. But all the other supports are already embedded. And I think this is a list of an example of all the supports that could be embedded. And so I'm not asking us to do all these, but if we try to do all these for one individual, this is where it becomes very difficult. This is where we say inclusion can't work. I can't accommodate for this individual and plan for the other 20. Again, reinforcement for why we're doing the framework, why we're thinking of universal design for learning, and the like. All right, some additional ideas in terms of what universal design for learning is focused on, everything from lessons to assignment options to flexible workspace to regular feedback and the scaffolds we provide. I'll let you look at that at your leisure. I know I'm running out of time with you. I have some templates for you to be able to utilize. You can click on these templates and get access to those to further implement universal design for learning. And then finally, if this has been helpful at all, feel free to reach out. Michael Fidellubi and I mentioned him earlier, we're part of the Learning Research Network. We work with Catholic schools across the country. Diocese, we've worked everything from program development to evaluation to implementation, professional development, virtual coaching. We've worked with parents and in terms of the parish leaders, and we've collaborated, as I mentioned before, with a number of different groups. So we'd love to engage you. Feel free to reach out. My email's on the front slide of this presentation, and of course included in the list that Beth shared out on the group that was there. So I hope this was helpful. I appreciate for the time, and I'm sorry I wasn't there face-to-face to be able to incorporate this. Welcome any questions, welcome any assistance in terms of your parishes, the families that you serve, the students that you're serving. As you can see, it's very much tied to my life, not only as a Catholic, but as an educator, but of course as a parent of a child with a disability. Hope this was helpful. Have a great rest of the day, and thanks for taking the time.